Hey, this is Armeline. We're going to take a look at one of the GameSalad templates I've prepared to help you adapt your game to any device. If you watch all these videos one after another, you're going to see a good bit of repetition, but I want each to be viewable independently, so please bear with that. In this video, we'll be looking at 720p landscape stretch. This template provides a non-iPhone 10 aspect ratio starting point in a landscape orientation. I went with 720p to give a bit more space to work with, but everything in this template will work equally well with an iPhone project file as your starting point instead. Stretch essentially means GameSalad will take the starting device size and stretch the image out to fit the device the game is being played on. This will cause noticeable distortion unless the game's camera is adjusted to compensate. Adjusting the camera will essentially add new space to the scene when viewing on different devices, making the visible area bigger than the starting scene. This video will look at how to do that using the provided template. This is most commonly going to be the best option for landscape games, as nothing is being cropped off, so if you're not sure which option to go with, you probably want to try this one first. Let's take a look at what space we'll have available on each device. If you take a look at the layer list, you'll see a group called device sizes. We have an iPad area device size and an iPhone 10 one. The red box shows you what part of the scene will be added on iPads. iPads have a taller aspect ratio than iPhones in 720p, so as you can see, we'll be adding a pretty hefty chunk up here at the top, and although you can't see it because it's being cut off, an equally sized chunk at the bottom. The yellow box shows you the part of the scene that will be added on an iPhone 10. iPhone 10 has a wider aspect ratio than iPhones and 720p, so we'll be adding a pretty hefty chunk to the left and the right. This is the size it's going to be adding on both sides, even though we can't see it all on the left here. This adding of new space doesn't happen automatically when you select the stretch option. It requires logic to be added to resize the camera appropriately. We'll first though take a look at what things look like if we don't add this logic, and then we'll look at what happens when you do. I've just crudely thrown together this mock-up of a basic game, so you've got something to see being affected by the stretching. All the assets are by Kenny from Kenny NL, and there's a link in the description, and it should be popping up in the corner now. First, let's take a look at the iPad. I'm going to select the iPad landscape preview option. You'll see it defaults to letterbox, but you never want to use letterbox as Apple will reject it. They'll reject any letterbox games with these ugly black bars. Google are a bit more forgiving, but they're not big fans of letterboxing either. So let's swap that to stretch. As you can see, the game has been stretched out in an ugly way. If the stretching isn't too bad, both Apple and Google will accept it, but the end result is not professional and your game will have no chance of being featured. Now let's take a look at how the scene looks on an iPhone X. It's stretching the opposite way, but it's still very ugly and unprofessional looking. Let's go back to our game scene and look at how we can adapt the camera to mitigate this ugly stretching with a little bit of logic. We'll be doing that in this actor I've named the Universalizer. This actor needs to access the scene camera though, which means it can only be done in unlocked actor. We access the unlocked Universalizer by double clicking the one on the scene rather than by using the actor list. So this is it here. We double click it and it will take us inside. You'll see I have a block of logic that I turned off to show you the ugly stretching. Let's turn it back on and have a quick look at what it does. First, it checks that the aspect ratio of the device is not the same as the starting scene. For a non-10 iPhone, it will be, so none of this will be run. You can arrange the logic differently and probably a little more efficiently than I've done in these templates at times, but I've tried to strike a balance between it being efficient and it being clear. If it finds the aspect ratio of the device does not match the starting scene, we'll need to calculate how much to adjust the camera width or height to avoid any ugly stretching. The image only gets stretched in one direction, so we only need to adjust either the height or the width of the camera depending on the device. Now we've turned all this logic on, let's take a look at how the game displays on an iPad and an iPhone 10. So we'll hit preview, iPad landscape, stretch. Here it is on the iPad. As you can see, there's now no distortion. The red areas here at the top and the bottom are what is being added to the scene, just as we saw with the device sizes actors. That's actually the device size actor giving us this red border at the top and the bottom. And let's have a quick look at the iPhone X. The yellow areas on the sides are what is being added. So let's head back into our universalizer actor. I'm not going to go into detail about the expressions here, but if you take the time to look at exactly what they're doing, they're not too hard to figure out. The end result, though, is that they're calculating how much to stretch the camera by in order to avoid that ugly stretching appearance, then taking the amount that's being added to the scene and putting it into the attribute game touches touch 11x. Once we have this number, we know how much, first of all, to move the camera origin by, but we also know how much to move our interface elements by to keep them nicely on the edges of the screen. I'll just turn off the camera origins and show you what happens if we don't move the camera origin. As you can see, since we didn't move the camera up, we've added double the amount to the top. And if we looked at the iPhone X, it would have added double the amount to the right. So we move the camera by half of this amount, by this red amount, to ensure that we're adding to the top and the bottom rather than just the top. If you want to add just the top, you can do that if you wish. The amount that's being moved is here in touch. Touch is touch 11x. I'm using this attribute as it's common to all projects, rarely ever used. This lets you drag and drop this logic from the template into your own game, as the attribute is common to both. If you might use touch 11x in your project, just create a new attribute and replace all the instances of touch 11x in the template with your new attribute. You can copy this whole block of logic into an unlocked actor on any scene in your game. Just make sure that the actor is at the very bottom of the layer list. This is very important. It needs to be the first actor GameSalad looks at each time it runs through the game's code, and GameSalad always starts with the bottommost actor. Having this number doesn't help us much though, unless we put it to use. So let's go into the menu button, which is this one up in this left corner, and tell it to move either left or up, depending on the device. Before we do though, let's take one more look at how this scene looks on an iPad and remind ourselves of what we want to happen. So the menu button is currently here. It's on the left-hand edge as it should be, but it needs to move up so that it's in this top corner. I've prepared some repositioning logic that will do this for us. Let's drag it in from the custom logic section. I've covered all the options here, moving things left, right, up or down, as well as automatically calculating which direction to move things. The two rules are the same as before. The first checks if something will need to move at all by comparing aspect ratios, and the second checks if we're going to be moving left or right, up or down, depending on the size of the screen that we're viewing the game on. You'll see I've included options to move things up or down, but also to position automatically based on the location of the actor on the scene. Let's preview with our automatic adjustment turned on. Since we're previewing on the iPad, we'll be using this top half of the rule here, and down in the bottom half will be the code for iPhone 10. So let's preview as an iPad and stretch. You'll see that our button has now moved up into the top corner where it should be. Let's take a slightly closer look at what the logic just did. First, it checks if the button is above or below the center of the screen. We figure out the center by taking the height and dividing it by 2. If it is above the center, we're going to be moving up. So we just take the Y position and add the amount that we've added to the screen divided by 2, because we only want the top part. If we were moving down, we would do the same, except for we would subtract. For iPhone 10, it will run this rule down here in the otherwise. It will check if it's left or right of the center and move left or right accordingly. Let's check it now. As you can see, the button is moved slightly to the left to account for the area of the screen that has been added. Sometimes you'll be able to move things automatically, sometimes you'll need to specify. Let's take out the unneeded logic from this rule and see the minimum we actually need to adapt this menu button for all iOS devices. It's moving up on an iPad, so we'll keep that. We'll get rid of these. And it's moving left on the iPhone X, so we'll keep this and get rid of these. So once we've removed the other options from our template logic, we're left with something pretty simple. Check if we need to move, check which direction we're moving, and then move. There's no specific need to remove the unused behaviors. GameSalad will automatically remove your turned off logic when it compiles your project. So there's no harm in leaving them, but I prefer to keep things simple, so I'm taking them out. Let's do the same now for the other controls in the corners. Our history button in the top right corner will need to move up on the iPad and right on the iPhone X. So all we need is these two just here. Our D-pad in the bottom left will need to move down on the iPad and left on the iPhone X. So down and left. Remember, you can normally use the automatic option if you're not sure what to pick. Our control pad in the bottom right will need to move down on the iPad and right on the iPhone X. That's the items in the four corners sorted, but what about the rest? The track in the center will not be moving on any device. That's a fixed point, and the scene will be adjusted around it. If you're using stretch, it's possible there'll be some stuff in the center that will need to move, but it's unusual enough that this template isn't going to cover it. The lap counter at the top does need to move, but only sometimes. If you're on an iPhone X, only the left and right are added to, so it won't need to move. It stays in the center on the X-axis. However, on an iPad, it will need to move. We'll need to move up as the top of the scene is being added to. So let's make it do that. There's no left or right movement, so we can ditch everything down here. It's only going to move up, so let's get rid of this other stuff as well. We should now have all our interface elements moving nicely to accommodate the new screen sizes. Let's check both. Here it is on an iPad, which is perfect, and here it is on the iPhone X. All our UI elements have been correctly moved so they sit nicely in the corners. As you can see though, there's still one more thing we need to do. The background is no longer covering the whole scene. Exactly how you deal with this will depend on the background of your game. For some games with complex non-tiling backgrounds, you'll want to stretch it, maintaining its proportions, so it covers all of the added areas. For some, you'll want to increase the size of the background by drawing new art to cover the areas added for different devices. Sometimes you might need to swap the background depending on the device that's detected. This background is a simple tiled effect, so we can easily add similar logic to it to stretch it out. Let's hop into it and do that now. All we're doing here is increasing the height or width of the background by the amount that's being added to the scene. Let's turn it on and have a quick look at an iPad and stretch. And you can see that now the background is filling the entire scene. I'm going to turn it off though for a minute to help illustrate the next point I need to discuss. There's one more thing you need to keep in mind when using the stretch option and adjusting the camera size. If we go back to the Universalizer actor, you'll see that one of the things we do is move the camera origin position. This matters because when GameSalad registers the position it touches, it does so without taking into account the camera's movement. It looks instead at the position on the screen. Let's add this debug actor to the scene and look at what this means. The top number shows the Y position of the debug actor. Now, if I tap as close as I can to the middle of the debug actor, you'll see the bottom number reflects the same or very close to the position of the debug actor. My touch and the position of the actor are the same. Now I'll change the device to iPad and set it to stretch. The scene is adapted beautifully, but look what happens if I click on the center of the debug actor. We get a very different number. The difference is the amount the camera was moved by, this red amount down here. 0 is no longer here at the bottom of the original scene like it was on the default device. It's all the way down here at the bottom of the device's screen. Actors in the game will keep their position relative to the camera, so as far as an actor is concerned, the very bottom of the iPad screen is below 0. For an actor, 0 remains here. Our touches, however, are calculated from the very bottom of the device's screen, all the way down here. If I move our debug actor to the bottom, you'll see I've got it at 0. If I go to iPad, it remains at 0, but this is a 0 touch down here, well, as close as I can get. This is about 120. So we need to account for that difference if we're calculating touch positions. This actor here shows how we can do this. First, let's turn off the correct logic and turn on this that simply spawns an actor at the current touch location. This temporary spawn actor behavior simply spawns at touch X and touch Y. On our 720p scene, our oil slicks spawn directly underneath our touches. Now let's look what happens on the iPad. Our touches are about 120 pixels lower than where the game thinks they are. This is the amount we've added to the bottom of the screen when adapting for our stretch. So all we need to do is adjust our spawns by that amount. If I turn that back off and turn this on, you'll see here I'm taking the total amount added, dividing it by 2 because we're only accounting for the bottom half of what's added, and subtracting it from our recorded touch location. For the iPhone X, the principle is exactly the same, except you take it off the X because it's adding to the left. So if I now preview on iPad and stretch, oil slicks are now spawning directly under my touches because we are accounting for that difference in position between the camera and the touch. So there you have it. One method of adapting your game for different device sizes. As I mentioned near the start, this is perhaps the most versatile option for universalizing your game. Adding tends to be better than removing, and 720p is a nice big starting device size that's easy to work with. If you're not sure what to go with, I recommend you try this one first. I hope this video has been helpful. Please feel free to get in touch with me if you have any questions or if you'd like to hire me to help you implement universal logic in your own game.